we proceed to the basics of data. In other words, if I saw data presented, what would be its usual structure or layout? You might have seen data in an Excel spreadsheet, and so usually it will have a two-dimensional structure, namely the rows and the columns, with each column bearing a title. So such a two-dimensional layout is called a data table. It's called a data table, or some might call it a data matrix. In a data table, we will have columns that represent variables, and we'll have rows that represent observations. So each row in the table represents the profile of a single loan amount. And how do we know that? Usually, when you see data, you want to ask questions about the where the data was collected, how the data was collected, on what or whom was the data collected. So I can see that there's a loan amount of about 7,500. So I know this is definitely not mortgage loan. And there's an interest rate, there's a term, there's a grade, there's a state. Sometimes reading through the titles of the columns might prompt us to ask questions, and such questions are better answered by the data dictionary. Take, for instance, the grade of this loan represents what? The loan grade for those who collected this data, and it can be from A through G and represents the quality of the loan and its likelihood of its being repaid. So, with that said, using data dictionaries can be very useful in establishing the context of the data set. The formal name for the rows of a data set is a case or an observational unit. So each loan in this case is an observational unit. Each loan was observed, and each row contains the profile of that loan. As far as the columns are concerned, the columns represent the characteristics of each loan. So for loan number 2, for instance, the first characteristic is the loan amount, which is $25,000 at an interest rate of 9.43%, expected to be paid in what? In full back in 60 months and so on. So each column there represents characteristics of that loan, and they're called variables. So in a nutshell, a data table is a two-dimensional structure that where the rows are otherwise called observational units and the columns are called variables. Let us proceed to basic terms in statistics. These are terms that these are words or terms we're going to use a lot in this class. And so we begin with population. This refers to the collection or set of all objects, whether living or non-living, or individuals of interest. You see, sometimes when we define a population of interest, it might be difficult due to limited resources to reach everyone in the population to collect data. So what do? We try to extract or to select a random and representative group from that population named the sample. So a sample is a subset or fractional part of the population that we're interested in studying, especially when it's impossible to study the entire population. With that said, let us explore what parameter is and statistic is in the world of statistical thinking. You see, a number that summarizes a property or characteristic of a population is called a parameter. Take, for instance, if I am able, due to more than limited resources, to collect data on the ages of everyone in this population, and I'm able to compute the average age for the entire population. This average age for the entire population is an example of a parameter. Otherwise, if I have limited resources and all I can access is the sample, and I collect data on the ages of all those in the sample, if I get the sample average age, this would be an example of a statistic, which is a number that summarizes or represents a property or characteristic of the sample drawn from the target population. All right, let's bring together with this example if we have come to understand some of these things. Here is an insurance company which would like to determine the proportion of all medical doctors who have been involved in one or more malpractice lawsuits. The company selects 500 doctors at random from a professional directory and determines the number in the sample who have been involved in a malpractice lawsuit. We are required to match the different phrases here, with the correct term. So, what will be the population of interest here? You might notice if you pause this video and look through this problem first before we solve it, that all medical doctors listed in the professional directory, that would be the population. Now, if we're not able to ask for data from all medical doctors listed in the professional directory, we might settle for the sample. So this sample must come from this population as a subset of that population. So what would that be? That would definitely be the 500 doctors selected at random from the professional directory. Take note, they're selected at random so that it is hopefully a representative subgroup of the population of interest. Then next, for the parameter, this must be a characteristic of the entire population based on what we discussed here. So, the proportion of keyword all medical doctors listed in the professional directory, that would be the parameter, because this fraction pertains to the entire population. Further, for the statistic, that must be a characteristic of the sample. So, in this case, that would be the proportion D, the proportion of medical doctors in the study, those who were selected to be in the study, who have been involved in one or more malpractice lawsuits. Then next, what varies? What is that variable that is being investigated? That would be whether a doctor has been involved in one or more malpractice suits. Then finally, from each of these doctors who have been surveyed in the sample, what would we get from them? It's going to be either yes or no. These are the data values.